If you would take out your note sheet from class today after the quiz, it looks like this, right? Chapter 7, Section 4, and we're really going to focus in on this top part, summarizing the presidential election of 1824, campaign results, and the impact. I had to go back to the old recording software because my free trial ran out on the other one, but I'm hoping to buy that pretty soon. We're going to look at we're going to look at the post-war of 1812 era, and we're going to be looking at specifically this goal of recognizing why the Federalist Party disappears, how nationalism takes off during the 18 teens, and then we're really going to get into identifying this next generation of American leaders, specifically focused on how they were all involved in this election of 1824. So have your notes ready? We're going to get going. In the War of 1812, the Federalist Party ends up being on the wrong side. And the reason why is they view this as a Democratic-Republican war, right? Madison was a Democratic-Republican. It seems to be anti-trade. It seems to be anti-England. And the Federalists in the Northeast, they make a mistake and they come out against the war. And all of that's fine until the Americans believe that they won the war, right? After the Jackson victory and the treaty, they're on the wrong side. What really is damning for the Federalist Party is this thing called the Hartford Convention, and I think this is something you'd want to have in your notes. At the Hartford Convention in 1814, the states in the Northeast, New England states, get together and they had a meeting where they considered leaving the Union. It's called secession, S-E-C-E-S-S-I-O-N. And at the Hartford Convention, they don't do it, but they talked about secession. And this is very interesting because later on down the road, we're going to have southern states that actually do secede from the Union, and that's what really provokes the Civil War. And so, despite the fact that the Federalist Party is going to disappear, what I want you to remember is that the philosophy, that Hamiltonian philosophy, is not going to disappear. The thing that's going to happen, and this is where it's going to get a little confusing for us for maybe about a week and a half here during this Jackson era, is that the Democratic Republicans, they won the war, and therefore they're going to be the party that survives. In 1816, we're going to have another Democratic Republican elected president in James Monroe. Henry Clay, who was one of those war hawks, is going to become a very political figure, but because there's no Federalist Party to be a part of, he's just a Democratic Republican. They all are. Everybody's a Democratic Republican. But Henry Clay has this thing called an American system. Now, he's a Democratic Republican, but look at what the American system is. The national bank, tariff, doing things so the central government pays to improve roads and other internal improvements. All of that is very Hamiltonian. Henry Clay is a Hamiltonian politician. He just doesn't have a Hamiltonian party to be a part of because that party had died. One other thing that I think we should review quickly before we get into this new era is the Missouri Compromise. Remember that going into the Missouri Compromise, there were exactly 11 free states and 11 slave states. Missouri was the first part of that Louisiana territory that met the requirements for statehood, which you can go back and review those steps in the process. But we know that there's a step missing because the federal government had not yet organized the Louisiana territory. So we weren't sure whether or not slavery could go to the west. Well, Missouri applies to be a slave state. That's MO, that's the postal abbreviation for Missouri. So the balance was going to be thrown off. It would be 12 slave states and 11 free states, and you know why when we did that data activity, why that's a problem. So Henry Clay proposes this compromise. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, Maine would come into the Union as a free state, and then 3630 would be this line of latitude that would establish the line of demarcation for future questions about slavery in the Louisiana Territory. So that's this line right here. So if you look at this, Missouri comes in as a slave state, right? Maine comes in as a free state, and this line, I'll go back to the other map because it's a little clearer. This line is the line of demarcation. Slavery is illegal up here. It'll be legal down here, and of course the state of Missouri will be a slave state, and it's north of that, but that'll be the only northern part of that territory that will have slavery. As a result of this, I'll come back to this and talk about this in class. We don't have to worry about this. think this is a link, and I don't want it to be a link. Okay, I'm kind of dead here. Sorry about that. I had a little technical difficulty there. I hope it wasn't too choppy. So the Missouri Compromise is really this last big thing that we have that's going to lead us into the election of 1824. So we had 3 two-term presidents in a row, all Democratic Republicans. We had Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. And so that's going to lead us into this election of 1824. Now, what's important to note about this election, first and foremost, is that there's only one political party. So how do you end up with competition? Well, we end up with competition because there's an issue, and that issue is financial problems. In 1819, there is a financial panic. You know, there's a lot of people, kind of what we went through about 3 years ago in the U.S. You know, there's a pretty massive recession. The economy's not doing very well, and a lot of people were blaming the Bank of the United States. Well, that brings an issue into this era of good feelings. We call it the era of good feelings because there was only one party. While it was continuing, there still is sectionalism. There still is this financial problem. And so the question is, who's going to lead next? Who's going to be the next president? And the leading politicians of the era are these guys. Andrew Jackson from Tennessee, who we know was a war hero. Henry Clay from Kentucky, he's the architect of the Missouri Compromise. He's the architect of this thing that we'll talk quite a bit about called the American System. He's a very powerful congressman. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, he had been around the world. He was a diplomat. He was James Monroe's Secretary of State, very powerful man in that administration. And then John C. Calhoun, I should finish that, right? John C. Calhoun, who's from South Carolina, and he was also a prominent war hawk. He's a very prominent Southern politician, and we know because of the 3/5 Compromise, that gives him sort of an advantage in the in the Electoral College. So this guy Andrew Jackson, and this is where I'm going to leave this video for today, and we'll really get into the election of 1824 on Monday. But this guy Andrew Jackson, he is an average American. He's born in rural North Carolina in Waxhaw, North Carolina. At an early age, 10, 11 years old, he's fighting in the Revolutionary War. He's actually captured, and a British soldier ordered him to do something, and he refused to. He said he was a prisoner of war, and he didn't have to do what he said. And the guy, hit him with the butt of his gun in his head. He carried a scar his whole life. During the Revolutionary War, his father was gone. During the Revolutionary War, his brother and his mother catch disease, and they both die, and he's on his own. And so he picks up and moves to Tennessee, where he starts a military career. He meets a woman, gets married, Rachel Donaldson, and his life really takes a turn with the Battle of New Orleans. And he's going to parlay that into a political career. Very popular man in Tennessee who will be elected to the House, he'll be elected to the Senate, and then ultimately, based on his experiences in the War of 1812 and also his ability to fight Indians in the aftermath, he's going to parlay that into a pretty significant political career, and he seems to be the most popular choice for president going into 1824. His greatest competition is probably this guy who was probably the most noteworthy politician. He was a politician. Henry Clay is from Kentucky. In his early career, he's a war hawk, but then he makes that transition to politics and he becomes the next generation's Alexander Hamilton. He's going to champion this thing called the American System, which is wanting to keep the Bank of the United States around. He wanted to have a tariff to protect American industry, and he's very ambitious. He wants to be president of the United States, and he's from Kentucky. He's from a slave state, and he's a slave owner. I think he looks a little bit like Kermit the Frog. You could tell me. John Quincy Adams, he obviously has family ties. His father was president of the United States. He has a lot of experience in foreign policy. He lived in Russia for a while. He lived in England with his father for a while. He bought Florida while he was Secretary of State. He writes this thing called the Monroe Doctrine while he's Secretary of State, and he is a staunch abolitionist. He is anti-slavery, and that's gonna, he is kind of the Federalist in this, but there is no Federalist Party, so he is the New England representative, and he looks a little bit like a hermit crab, I think. The last guy is John C. Calhoun. He's from South Carolina. He is a Southern aristocrat. He married into money. He starts out kind of a clay nationalist. He supports the Bank of the United States, but then he starts to realize that his real strength is in this Jeffersonian philosophy, which is sectionalism is going to be protected, or I should say his sectional beliefs are going to be protected by states' rights. If you're a supporter of slavery, you're not going to get much help from the North, and so you really want your states' rights to be protected. He will take up the case of nullification from the Kentucky Resolution as he's the vice president. I think that one's a dead ringer, don't you? And so we're going to get into the election of 1824 on Monday in class, but these are the players. You got Henry Clay, you got John Quincy Adams, you got this guy, William Crawford, who we haven't talked about. This should be John C. Calhoun. We'll talk about why it's William Crawford on Monday, and you've got Andrew Jackson. So we'll pick up on this on Monday. So right now you have kind of in your notes on the right-hand side, you should have the background of what you're summarizing the election of 1824. And we're going to make sure on Monday that you really understand that.